Story 1. The September Dorm Room. Emily Caldwell had dreamed of this moment for years. The start of college, the escape from her small hometown, the promise of new friendships and independence. Her parents had dropped her off at Harrington Hall on a humid late August morning, waving proudly as she carried boxes up the creaking wooden stairs. She was too excited to care about the heat or the sweat soaking her back. The dorm itself looked like something from another era. Red brick walls, ivy twisting up toward tall arched windows, and heavy oak doors polished to a dull sheen. The building had been standing since 1908, long before cell phones and laptops, and though the university brochure called it historic, the students whispered a different word: haunted. Emily didn't believe in that nonsense. Ghost stories were for campfires, not college campuses. She was here for new beginnings, not old legends. Her room was on the second floor, tucked into a corner that overlooked the courtyard. The plaster walls were cracked in places, and the wood floors bowed slightly, but she loved it instantly. She spent the first day pinning fairy lights around the window frame, setting up her desk, and arranging her books on the shelf. Her new roommate, Taylor, seemed nice enough, if a little distant, and by the first night, Emily was asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of what lay ahead. The first week passed in a blur of orientation events, cafeteria food, and awkward small talk. Harrington Hall creaked and groaned at night, but Emily chalked it up to age. It wasn't until the second week of September that things began to shift. It started with something small. When Emily woke one morning, she noticed her desk chair had been pulled out. She always tucked it in before bed. It was practically a ritual, but there it was, pushed back as if someone had sat down. "Taylor, did you use my desk?" she asked, groggy. Her roommate shook her head, brushing mascara onto her lashes. "Nope. Why would I?" Emily shrugged it off. Maybe she'd forgotten. But the same thing happened the next night. And the one after. By the end of the week, she woke to find the chair in the middle of the room, facing her bed. Her stomach tightened with unease, but she said nothing. It was easier to pretend it didn't matter. A few nights later, she woke to a soft creak, the sound of her closet door opening. Her heart thudded as she sat up. The brass handle gleamed faintly in the moonlight as the door swung wider, yawning into the dark. Emily stared at it for a full minute, frozen. Finally, she slid out of bed, tiptoed across the cold floor, and pushed it shut. She turned the handle until it clicked firmly into place. Then, holding her breath, she climbed back into bed. She had barely pulled the blanket over her chest when the creak came again. Slowly, deliberately, the closet door opened. Emily bolted upright, fumbling for her phone. Its screen lit the room in a pale blue glow. The closet stood open once more, nothing but shadows inside. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. By mid-September, the nights were colder. Emily pulled on sweatshirts and huddled under blankets, but the draft seeping through the old windows was relentless. That was when the scratching began. At first, she thought it was mice. Harrington Hall was old, after all. It came in slow, deliberate strokes. Free scratches. Pause. Free scratches. Always from the wall directly behind her bed. She told herself it was nothing. She even joked about it to Taylor, who only raised an eyebrow and said she was imagining things. But one night, desperate to prove it was all in her head, Emily pressed her ear to the plaster. What she heard made her blood run cold. It wasn't mice. It wasn't pipes. It was a voice. Faint, muffled, but clear enough to make her breath catch. "Let me out." Emily jerked back, her heart hammering. She stared at the wall, waiting for the sound to return, but the silence that followed was worse than the whisper itself. The next morning, Emily cornered her RA, a junior named Kelly. "There's something in my wall," Emily said. Her voice trembled despite her best effort. "I heard it." A voice. Kelly gave her a sympathetic smile. "Harrington's ancient. You're gonna hear all kinds of weird stuff. Pipes, drafts, settling wood. Trust me, every freshman freaks out their first month." "I'm not freaking out," Emily insisted. "This isn't pipes." It said. She hesitated. The words felt ridiculous out loud. It said, "Let me out." Kelly chuckled, though unease flickered in her eyes. "Spooky. Save it for Halloween, okay?" Emily walked away, burning with frustration. Nobody believed her. The days blurred together. Class, Cafeteria, study sessions. On the surface, everything looked normal. But every night, the scratching returned. Louder. Closer. Her desk chair now moved almost daily, sometimes positioned directly beside her bed. The closet door swung open no matter how hard she slammed it shut. Sleep became impossible. Emily's grades slipped. She stopped eating meals with friends, too exhausted to pretend. One night, she woke to find her textbooks stacked in a neat tower beside her bed. Another night, she swore she saw a shadow crouched at the foot of her mattress, but when she blinked, it was gone. Taylor transferred to another dorm by the end of the month. Just didn't vibe with the place, she said, but Emily wondered if she'd seen more than she admitted. Now Emily was alone. When maintenance came for routine inspections, Emily begged them to check her wall. Two older men with tool belts humored her, rapping their knuckles against the plaster. One frowned. That's hollow. They set to work, chiseling away at the wall as Emily watched, her pulse quickening with every strike. Dust filled the air. After nearly an hour, the plaster gave way, revealing a narrow wooden opening. The air that poured out was thick, rank, and freezing. Emily gagged. One of the men shone his flashlight inside. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the beam of light revealed bones. Small bones, curled tightly into themselves. A skeleton wedged in the narrow space, arms twisted, fingers clawing at the wooden beams. And on those beams, gouged deep with fingernails long since rotted away, were scratches. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Above the remains, a single word was carved into the wood. Emily's knees buckled. She stumbled back, her stomach lurching. The men muttered to each other, pale-faced, before sealing the opening again and calling the police. But Emily didn't need the police to tell her what had happened. She already knew. The whispers, the scratching, the voice. Whoever had died inside that wall hadn't left. That night, Emily refused to go back to her room. She curled up on the common lounge couch, staring at the flickering glow of the TV. The laughter of her classmates drifted from down the hall, jarring against the heavy dread that pressed on her chest. She had just begun to doze when a cold breath brushed her ear. "Let me out." She bolted upright, heart hammering. The lounge was empty, but the words still echoed in her head. She thought about leaving Harrington Hall, about transferring schools, even. But no matter how far she went, she feared the voice would follow. Because the moment she pressed her ear to that wall, the moment she listened, she hadn't just heard it. She had answered. And now, it would never let her go. Story 2. The September Harvest. September in Willow Creek always carried the scent of endings. The summer air turned brittle, mornings carried a bite, and the land itself seemed restless, groaning beneath the weight of harvest. For most, it was a season of fairs and hayrides, pumpkin pies cooling on windowsills and laughter echoing across rust-colored fields. But for Thomas, who worked on his uncle's farm just outside town, September had always felt different. He couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was the long, endless rows of corn, their stalks rattling like dry bones in the wind. Maybe it was the silence that fell once the sun slipped behind the tree line, leaving the farm steeped in darkness. Or maybe it was the old stories, whispered in the town's taverns, about things that moved between the rows after nightfall. He never gave much thought to those tales, until the autumn he turned 21. It was near dusk when he first saw it. He and his uncle, Earl, had been working the fields since sunrise, their hands blistered and backs aching. The final stretch of corn loomed ahead, the stalks brittle and yellowing, ready to be cut and gathered. Earl, a grizzled man with skin weathered by decades of work, called it a day and headed toward the barn. Thomas stayed behind, leaning on his rake, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. That's when he noticed it. At the far end of the field, half hidden among the rows, stood a figure. Tall, still, arms outstretched at awkward angles. A scarecrow. Thomas frowned. His uncle never used scarecrows. He preferred wire fencing and repellents. He'd always said scarecrows invited more trouble than they solved. "Earl," Thomas shouted, squinting against the dimming light. "You put that thing up?" But his uncle was already inside, the barn door slamming shut behind him. When Thomas turned back, the scarecrow was gone. The next morning, The figure wasn't there. Thomas almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, the exhaustion of harvest playing tricks on his eyes. But that night, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, he saw it again. This time, it wasn't at the far edge of the field. It was standing just beyond the barn, arms dangling loosely at its sides, head cocked as though listening. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Thomas swallowed hard. "Uncle Earl," he said quietly as they locked up tools for the night. "Did you see it? Out there." Earl gave him a long, tired look. "Boy, you best keep your eyes on your work, not on shadows. Harvest's hard enough without spook stories." Thomas nodded, but he couldn't shake the image. That night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard rustling outside his window. When he pulled back the curtain, the scarecrow was standing at the fence line, watching. By the third night, Thomas was rattled. His uncle's dismissals only made him feel more alone. As they finished supper, Thomas asked carefully, "You sure we don't own a scarecrow?" Earl set down his fork with a sharp clatter. "I told you before. Don't talk about it." The finality in his voice sent a chill crawling up Thomas's spine. Later, when the farmhouse fell silent, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The wind howled through the fields, carrying the dry rattle of corn husks. Somewhere beyond the walls, something shifted. A low creak. The sound of weight on wood. Thomas sat up slowly. His breath fogged in the air. It was colder than it should have been. He turned toward the window. The scarecrow was no longer at the fence. It stood pressed against the glass. Its head twitched, straw spilling from beneath its hat, and though its face was nothing but burlap stitched into a crude grin, Thomas felt its gaze burn into him. He stumbled back, heart slamming, but when he blinked, it was gone. By the fourth night, Thomas was unraveling. His uncle avoided his questions, the neighbors didn't believe him, and sleep had become impossible. That evening, he found straw scattered in the barn, though none of their bales had been touched. Earl cursed under his breath, muttering about vandals, but Thomas wasn't so sure. They locked every door, bolted every window. But deep down, Thomas knew it wouldn't matter. The scarecrow wanted in. That night, he woke to the sound of rustling. Not outside. Inside. He sat up slowly, every nerve in his body screaming. The smell hit him first, earthy, damp, and sweet, like rotting hay. Then came the sound. A slow, deliberate shuffle, straw dragging across wood. Thomas turned his head. The scarecrow was in his room. It stood at the foot of his bed, hat shadowing its stitched grin, its arms dangling with straw spilling from the sleeves. With each step it took toward him, the air grew colder, heavier, until Thomas could barely breathe. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The last thing he felt was the brush of straw against his skin. Earl found him at dawn. Thomas lay in bed, eyes open, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He was alive, but wrong. His skin was cracked, brittle, flaking like husks peeled from corn. Straw littered the sheets, tangled in his hair, pressed into the folds of his clothing. His lips parted as if to speak, but only a dry whisper escaped. "Let me grow." Earl stumbled back, horror etched across his face. He knew then what had happened, though he'd prayed it never would. The stories were true. The land demanded its tithe. And this year, it had chosen Thomas. Outside, the fields rattled with the sound of wind through dry stalks. And at the edge of the corn, a new scarecrow stood. It wore Thomas's face. Story 3, The September Substitute. September had always carried a sense of unease for Sarah. It wasn't just the end of summer or the heavy air that clung to her small town as the season shifted. It was the feeling of starting over, of unfamiliar hallways and new schedules, of watching the leaves curl and fall as though the world itself was preparing to decay. Her sophomore year of high school had only just begun, and already she felt that tight coil of nerves in her chest every morning before class. On Monday, she filed into history class with her friends expecting MS. Carter, the warm, cheerful teacher with a soft laugh and a habit of humming as she passed out worksheets. But instead, a stranger stood at the front of the room. He was tall, uncomfortably so, his shoulders stooped as though weighed down by invisible chains. His clothes didn't fit right. His shirt was starched and buttoned all the way to his neck, but the fabric looked old, almost yellowed, as if it had been left in a closet for decades. His trousers were creased sharply, yet they too seemed outdated, the kind of clothing her grandfather wore in faded photographs from the 1950s. His eyes. Sarah tried not to stare, but it was impossible to ignore. They were sunken deep into his skull, ringed with shadows, and when they swept across the room, she swore her chest went cold, as if his gaze carried a chill with it. He didn't introduce himself. He simply lifted a long, pale hand and motioned for them to open their books. His voice followed a moment later. Turn to chapter 4. It was low, rough, yet oddly resonant, echoing strangely against the walls. Sarah glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see a speaker crackling above her head. But there was none. The first period was unbearable. He never blinked. Not once. Every time Sarah looked up from her book, he was watching, though not always her. Sometimes his gaze landed on one of the other students, pinning them in place until they squirmed or looked down. His presence filled the room like smoke, heavy and suffocating, though no one dared to say anything. By Wednesday, the unease had turned into something darker. 2 desks sat empty that morning. Jenna and Aaron, both of whom had been in class Monday, hadn't shown up since. Sarah assumed they were sick, maybe had caught the flu that always seemed to sweep through the school at the start of the year. But the substitute never acknowledged their absence. He didn't ask for attendance, didn't note who was there or who wasn't. Instead, Sarah noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. On Jenna's desk, faint lines had been carved into the wood. She leaned closer when the teacher's back was turned, her hair falling like a curtain to shield her. It was Jenna's name, carved deep, jagged, as if etched by a knife or some other sharp tool. She jerked back, heart hammering. By Thursday, Aaron's desk bore the same mark. His name, scratched violently into the wood, letters uneven but unmistakable. Sarah couldn't focus on the lessons, if they could even be called that. The substitute never explained, never taught, only commanded them to read. His chalk scraped across the board, but the words made little sense. Sometimes they were phrases pulled directly from the book, but other times they were things Sarah couldn't understand. Symbols, names, dates from centuries ago. The atmosphere in the classroom grew heavier each day. Her classmates whispered nervously, but never when he was near. Even the bravest of them, kids who normally laughed through lectures, sat stiff and silent under his gaze. On Friday morning, Sarah knew something was wrong before she even entered the room. The hallway was oddly quiet, muffled. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly. And when she stepped into the classroom, the air felt different, thicker, colder. Her breath fogged faintly, though it wasn't nearly cold enough outside for that to make sense. The substitute was already at the board, his hand moving in deliberate strokes. At first, Sarah thought he was writing notes. But then she realized they weren't notes at all. They were names. Her classmates' names. One by one, in that same jagged handwriting, etched in chalk across the green surface. Some of the names had already been carved into desks. Others were still present, sitting frozen in their seats, their eyes wide as the teacher wrote. When he got to hers, Sarah, his hand lingered, pressing so hard the chalk snapped in half. He dropped the piece, but didn't bend to pick it up. His head turned slowly, almost mechanically, until his hollow eyes fixed on her. Sarah's stomach dropped. Something inside her screamed to run. She bolted from her desk, ignoring the startled gasps of her classmates. The substitute didn't shout, didn't chase. He only watched as she tore open the door and sprinted down the hall. The principal's office wasn't far, but the corridors stretched endlessly, each step pounding louder than the last. When she finally burst inside, gasping for breath, she found Principal Daniels bent over paperwork. He looked up, startled. "Sarah? What on earth?" "There's something wrong with the substitute in history class," she blurted out. "He's writing our names. People are disappearing. He's not." The words tangled together in her panic, but Daniels raised a hand to stop her. His brow furrowed in confusion. "Sarah, what substitute?" "MS. Carter's out sick this week. That classroom has been locked." Her heart plummeted. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible. I was just there." Everyone was there. But Daniels was already rising, pulling keys from his pocket. He led her down the hall, his pace brisk, his expression hard. She wanted to believe he'd see the truth, that she wasn't losing her mind. When they reached the classroom, Daniels fit the key into the door and turned. The lock clicked, the handle groaned, and the door swung open. The room inside was empty. Dark. Dust coated the desks in thick layers, undisturbed. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the windows. It smelled stale, abandoned, as if no one had stepped foot inside for years. Sarah's knees went weak. Her desk was there. She could see her bag on the floor. But it was wrong. It was old, ragged, covered in dust. Like something left behind in a forgotten attic. Her voice trembled. "I was just here. We were all just here." Daniels looked at her sharply, concern clouding his eyes. "Sarah, maybe you should go see the nurse." But then they both froze. From inside the room, faint and hollow, came the sound of chalk against board. Screech. Drag. Screech. Daniel's face went pale. Slowly, as if against his will, his head turned toward the blackboard at the front of the room. The air grew colder, their breath puffing white in the dim light. And there, etched in fresh white letters, was a single word. Sarah. Her name. Written again. And again. And again. Until the entire board was filled. She screamed.